in this situation, pesticides were actually a substantial public issue through the 1950s, more for their presence in food than their environmental effects. And in 1958 was passed the first really strong control on pesticides. This was called the Delaney Clause, and the way it was passed was sort of a mirror image of what Congressman Cannon did in 1937. Congressman Delaney was a member of the Rules Committee, which at that time had control over everything that got passed in the House. They could stop anything. And everything went through them kind of last before it went up. So you didn't want to get in a fight with a member of the Rules Committee, and they could monkey with the bills at the last minute. So Congressman Delaney slipped in a clause that's to some bill that was mostly about other things that said that that no detectable cancer-causing substances could be allowed in any processed food. 1 year later, some pesticides that cause cancer were detected in cranberries right before Thanksgiving, and the entire cranberry crop was condemned right before Thanksgiving, which naturally made a very big stir. 3 years later, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which really summarized, it's important to understand, she was summarizing science that had been done by a lot of people over the preceding 20 years. She didn't invent the science. She brought it together. She was a brilliant writer, and she also put it in a broader context, that this isn't just a local problem. This is an issue about the future of our world, which, I mean, that was really new with her. And President Kennedy asked his Science Advisory Council to do a study of the issues raised by Silent Spring, and the Science Advisory Committee basically agreed with Rachel Carson. But the pesticide manufacturers by this time had a lockhold on Congress, and there was no real change in the laws till the 70s. Through the 60s, concern about the environment kept growing. It culminated in Earth Day in 1970, which was just an enormous outpouring of people. And at that point, you started getting a flood of legislation. President Nixon, who had actually, when he first came to office, clipped the wings of the FDA because the chemical companies didn't like the FDA. He felt like he could, he was already fighting the Vietnam War. He didn't want to have like another big fight. And then on top of that, so he didn't want to take on environmentalism head on. And on top of that, he was expecting to run against Senator Muskie in the '72 election. Senator Muskie was the sponsor of the environmental laws. So they passed the Clean Air Act. Nixon, by executive order, set up EPA and put a really strong environmentalist in charge. A really strong Clean Air Act was passed, and Nixon signed it. And then the Clean Water Act, which is also very strong law, was passed in Congress in 1972. By the time the Clean Water Act got out of Congress, it was election time. McGovern had been nominated, and Nixon knew he was going to win in a landslide, so he vetoed the Clean Water Act. Congress actually stayed in session, theoretically, and then came back to Washington to override Nixon's veto of the Clean Water Act. What remained, though, to be done was dealing with pesticides and with the precautionary principle. There was a new pesticide law in 1972, which was much more of a compromise than the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, where those laws said that the environment and human health come first and monetary cost comes second. the pesticide law that was passed says that you have to balance the economic benefit of using the pesticide against the risk to human health and the environment. It did get rid of registration under protest. It got rid of a number of really intolerable things in the earlier law, but it's not as strong as those other two laws. Still, we had the question of other new chemicals, and are we going to follow the precautionary principle? And that was addressed in 1976 by what's called the Toxic Substance Control Act. That was another law like a couple of the ones we have talked about. Theoretically, it gives the EPA the authority to ban any substance, any chemical that is so toxic that it should be banned. I don't know the exact language. But again, there are so many restrictions that in practice that authority is completely useless. EPA wasn't even able to get through all the hoops to demonstrate that asbestos should be banned. There was one group of chemicals that really inspired it called PCBs that was found all over the world and is similar to DDT. That was banned in the law, and that was really the only accomplishment of that law. Now, since then, we have a whole lot of other kinds of chemicals coming into our environment. We are learning that there are drugs in streams, plasticizers, chemicals that act like hormones, and all sorts, flame retardant chemicals that are found to be very resistant to breaking down and are being found all over the world. And so these new chemicals remain as the unaddressed agenda. The Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act really have made enormous progress in cleaning up the chemicals that they were aimed at. But now we have these new threats to the environment and that are coming here and are a growing problem very similar to what we had in the 60s with the more basic pollutants. And so Congressman Henry Waxman last year introduced a bill called the Safer Chemicals Act that would fix the failure in 1976 to regulate industrial chemicals. It would finally put the precautionary principle into American law. In Europe, the European Union has passed a chemical law that makes the chemical companies test their chemicals, but we are not doing that here. The Safer Chemicals Act made a good deal of progress in last year's Congress, but did not pass. Now, for reasons that I don't have to explain, it's not going anywhere this year, but it is a very important piece of legislation that needs to be worked on and pushed. It requires education about it, and it will have to be dealt with in a future Congress if we're not going to have new and growing environmental problems. Now, I want to finish by talking a little bit about the lessons of all this. You know, these stories sound bad. They are bad. But I do draw some hopeful lessons from this. First is that the scientific community science has a great ability to bring out the truth. You know, there was a tremendous effort made to suppress good science, prevent good science from being done, but repeatedly they hold it down in one place and sometimes for quite a while, but eventually the truth pops up somewhere else. And the scientific community has an ethic of seeking the truth that is hard for those who want to suppress it to overcome. Not at all impossible, but hard. You know, Rachel Carson, what she did in Silent Spring, that was all based on science that had been done in the 40s and 50s. A second thing that I find hopeful is about regulation. You know, there's a theory out there that it's impossible for the government to regulate anything because the regulators sort of fall into line with the people they're supposed to be regulating by a sort of process of invisible mental osmosis. That's not the way it has happened, at least in the environmental world. It's when the regulators were indeed captured, but they were captured by the direct application of economic and political pressure. And there were plenty of agencies that were not captured. The FDA, two others that come up in other areas, the Bureau of Mines, and the Corps of Engineers was actually an environmental regulator in the 1920s. The capture of regulators is not inevitable. The key thing in stopping it is public pressure. If there is public pressure that pushes back, the regulators can and usually will do their jobs. But there has to be that pressure because there will be pressure on the other side. Thank you.